The second lesson from Paul's letter to the church in Rome, the 8th chapter. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead has made his home in you, then he who raised Jesus from the dead will give life to your own mortal bodies through his Spirit living in you. So then, my friends, we are not to be obligated to a human nature so as to be dominated by it. If you do live that way, you're doomed to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the habits originating in the flesh, you will have life. All who are guided by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For what you received was not the spirit of slavery to force you back into fear. You received the Spirit of adoption, enabling you to cry out, Father. The Spirit himself joins with our spirit to bear witness that we are children of God. And if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, provided that we share his suffering so as to also share his glory. Let us bow together for a moment. In the midst of life, with all its preoccupations and cares, ambitions and worries, grant us a space apart, a moment here, available to another word, a different word, a word which is our life. In the Spirit of Jesus, Amen. Well, the magic of April is almost on our doorstep. I'll remember April, to be in England now that April's there, April in Paris. It's a warm wind, the west wind, full of birds' cries. I hear the west wind, but tears are in my eyes, for it comes from the west lands, old brown hills, and April's in the west wind, and daffodils. Have you ever noticed they don't sing songs about September or write poems about February? At least not around here. But April, the month of Easter, the month of life stirring again, the month when the winter blues begin to fade, I hope, before the vitality and color in the world around. But too easily we forget that it is February that makes April all it is. We forget that death came before new life. We ignore a reality that an old faith urges upon us again and again, not only about nature, but about human existence. Death and life are not enemies. They belong together. If you be crucified with Christ, so shall you be raised with him. We were baptized into death so that we might rise to newness of life. If you put to death the base pursuits of the flesh, then you will live. Strange language, don't you find it so? Perhaps the most important letter ever written, perhaps the most obscure letter ever written. We especially have trouble with it in our time. We can sympathize with a little child who prayed, Dear God, instead of letting people die and having to make new ones, why don't you just keep the ones you've got now? They didn't have quite the same trouble back in the time when Paul wrote, for death was an ever-present companion. It was part of the warp and woof of daily existence. One grew up with death as well as life. Even 150 years ago, among us, it was a much more common occurrence, not hid away in hospital or funeral home. But with our modern medicine and our modern maturity, we find it easier to keep our distance, don't we? To act as if it'll never happen to us, or at least act as if we need not think about it. As Woody Allen put it, it's impossible to think about one's own death objectively and still carry a tune. I've had the hospital personnel tell me that when someone dies, they often become invisible to the staff. They represent failure. Everyone disappears. Someone posted an article on an obstetrical floor which read, recent research shows that the first 5 minutes of life are very risky. Underneath, someone else scrawled, the last 5 minutes are not so hot either. As I say, this is all rather unfortunate because it is not only a final death that we need to learn to be a bit more comfortable with, there is a dying that must go on all the time in life if we're really going to learn life. According to Jesus and Paul, that's the case. It's interesting how the early Christians took the story of this week, so familiar, so unheard perhaps, the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, took it not only as a one-time event somewhere back in the past, but took it as a pattern, as a model, as a metaphor for life itself this side of the grave. Life is not just a matter of birth and then grow, grow, grow until we collapse. One must die as well as live. If you put to death all the base pursuits of the flesh, then you will live, says Paul. Here's a dying that presumably we are to let happen to us with each new day. What's he talking about? As usual, Paul is difficult. But what he means is something like this: we must die to sin if we want to live. There's that word. Not very popular in our time. The late Karl Menninger, founding psychiatrist of the famous clinic, felt it necessary to write a book entitled Whatever Happened to Sin? Conversation at the reception was brisk, the young clergyman unprepared for the onslaught from a prominent newspaper publisher, a woman whose ancestors had been among the founding families of his new parish. I don't go to church anymore myself, she said casually as she introduced herself. Every time I go, all they talk about is sin. To which he responded, I have something of the same objection to your newspapers. I don't use the word often because I think it has developed connotations in our culture that are far from biblical. But I should warn you that I really talk about the subject all the time. When we talk about sin, we're talking about our obsession with trying, first and foremost, to save our own lives. We're talking about the driving passion that we often exhibit to preserve our security, our popularity, our pride, our dignity, our control of the world around us at all costs. The tendency to make these that which shapes our lives. That's what the old biblical word sin is really all about. It's not simply about things we do that cause others harm or hurt. It's about a propensity deep within all of us to put our own needs and desires first. Needs and desires that we have to face up to and relinquish a bit, let go of, die to, put the knife in, if we're ever going to know real life in this world. Needs and desires that we let take over all too frequently. The need to be liked. How many young people get into trouble because they're driven by that need, because it's uppermost in their consciousness? The need to win. A recent business columnist insists that part of the reason for violation of rules on Wall Street is because, quote, a fraternity house atmosphere prevails. Young men are caught up in proving themselves the winners, no matter the risks, no matter the cost. The need to be approved by those closest to us. One woman tells how after years of persuasion, her mother was finally talked into having a cataract operation. The daughter hoped that finally her mother would be less complaining and controlling and more appreciative. Returning home from the hospital, the mother sat down in front of the picture window in the living room, which looked out on a lovely lake. Do you notice any difference, Mother? The daughter asked. I certainly do, Mother replied. Don't you ever dust? Now, what's the point? It's funny, but not so. The good life, the life that leads to happiness and joy for ourselves and those around us, requires a few deaths. That is to say, we have to let die some measure of the needs and desires that tend to drive us, dominate us, obsess us, so that we can get on to better things, giving ourselves to the labors and loves of real life. Simple illustration, any athlete knows this. He can't indulge himself, follow every whim and appetite that comes along and still play the game well. Rodman to the contrary. One set of desires must die if another set of goals are to live. Presumably a true story about a burly lineman for a pro football team who tried to have it both ways. He stayed out way past curfew. He'd pile things under his blanket, making it appear that he was in bed when bed check time came. At one hotel, however, he couldn't find enough things to stuff under the blanket, so he grabbed a floor lamp and stuck it under the covers and then went out. when a suspicious coach peeked in at 1 a.m. and snapped on the light switch, the bed lit up. Seriously, all great religion has one thing in common. It is the insistence that mature, responsible, and ultimately joyful life requires relinquishment of obsession with infantile desires, relinquishment of the need to be first always, or right always, or secure always, or liked always, or comfortable always. Psychologist Scott Peck tells of one of his toughest sessions with a woman he called Charlene. At a crucial point in their work together, he asked her what she thought the purpose of life was. Being a Christian, she said, we exist for the glory of God. But she said it in a flat, low monotone, as if she were sullenly repeating an alien catechism learned by rote and extracted from her at gunpoint. Well, Peck asked. There was a short silence. For a brief moment, he said he thought she might cry, the only time that had ever happened in their time together. But then she said, I can't do it. There's no room in me for that. That would be my death. I want to live for me. It's a fundamental move, relinquishing a bit one's own inordinate needs and desires, dying to self, Jesus calls it, in order to live for God and the only life worth living. And it's a move that we have to make again and again. Paul says at one point, I die daily. All those needs to be first, right, winner, liked, absolutely secure, comfortable, let go of them, give them up a bit, let them die, because then you will discover what real life is all about. And what's that? That's what the story of this day and this week are finally about. A 36-year-old man out of Galilee, that's about the age the scholars now say he was. 36-year-old man out of Galilee rides into the capital city in the style of one of the old kings of Israel. The people had anxiously, feverishly waited for just such a person, such a figure, such a Messiah, such a deliverer from God. For God had been silent for centuries, and the Romans cruelly reigned, crushing the poor of the land into the dust. And on his donkey, to the waving of palms, Jesus is saying loud and clear, the day of your deliverance has arrived. That's why they're cheering. But he rides into town knowing that what he brings them by way of deliverance is not what they want. And what is that? What everybody wants. Bread and circus, privilege and power, comfort and ease, everything life has deprived them of. And what is he going to give them? A death. One solitary death of suffering love. Now be clear, he doesn't want to die. He sweats blood before he brings himself to do it. He loves life perhaps more than anyone ever has, embraces the beauty of those Galilean hills, the joy of time with friends about the table, the warmth of children in his company. Here's a man deeply in love with life. And yet he's willing to die to all that, leave it all behind, sacrifice it all while young in years for love of his people. Approaching the city, he weeps for them. Oh, that you knew what really makes for life. For love of his people, he's prepared even to die, to show them how God loves them, and to show them how they must love if they're ever going to know real life. Rather than run, rather than reign, he dies in love to show them where real life lies. Now, if that sounds strange, stop and think of it a bit. Even when we feebly manage it, isn't this true of our loves? They have a little bit of dying about them. Louis Everly writes, to be a real father is precisely to suffer. Because to become a real father is to become vulnerable to the pains and hurts of your children. As long as one is young, one is selfish, defended, no doubt one has terrible blues, melancholies, but one holds one's own pretty well, one withdraws easily, one suffers only for oneself. But our compassion for the other, well, when one becomes a father or a mother, one is suddenly vulnerable in the most sensitive part of one's being. One is completely powerless to defend oneself from the hurts of the other. Elizabeth Stone once wrote that having a child is to decide to have your heart go walking around outside your body. Any good marriage involves two people who are willing to die a bit on behalf of the needs and troubles of the other. And I do suspect that many a marriage runs aground in our time because young people assume they have a right to a relationship that is always comfortable. Somehow they miss the words read so often of a Saturday afternoon right here, words about a love that suffers long, that bears, that endures, as well as hopes and trusts. Such love always has a bit of dying about it, does it not? But we slowly learn over time that it also has a whole lot more real life about it. As one of the NATO nations, we are engaged with our power to try and bring a measure of justice and peace to a war-torn part of the world. Pray God we'll be able to do that. But however you feel about it, let us never forget that true life together in human community comes only when people are able to get beyond tribal identity, are open to a spirit that enables us to bear with one another, live with one another, rather than die before one another. I repeat, Jesus rides into Jerusalem to show us how God suffers us, bears with us, endures us. God does not come to change our world, but he comes to bear with us the pain and trouble of this world. And he rides into Jerusalem to call us to die to ourselves with him as he did, opening ourselves to his kind of suffering love in the confidence that it leads to the only real life worth living here and hereafter.